All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. So, what we're going to be talking about today is going to be something that a lot of people have mentioned, right? Or don't like to talk about or don't like to deal with, but we're going to be discussing change management. But we're going to be talking about the best practices for change management. Okay, so one thing I want you to understand is change management is one of the most constant realities in organizations. Change, not change management, excuse me. Whether your organization is adopting new technology, restructuring departments, revising policies, improving processes, changing leadership, or responding to external pressures, or change is just unavoidable. However, change may be necessary, but it's not always easy. People often resist change. As human beings, we are naturally going to resist change because it creates uncertainty. Employees may wonder how the change will affect their roles, workload, job security, relationships, routines, or even performance expectations. That's why change management is not simply about introducing something new. What it's really about is about guiding people, processes, and systems through a transition in a way that supports understanding, commitment, and performance. Now, your change management can be a structured approach that you can use as a leader to move, your organization from its current state to a desired future state. The goal is not only to implement change, but to make sure the change is understood, accepted, sustained, and aligned with the organization's mission. One of the first best practices for change management is establishing a clear purpose for the change. People need to understand why change is necessary. As a leader, you must explain the problem, the opportunity, or strategic need driving the change. If employees do not understand the reason behind the change, they may see it as unnecessary, disruptive, or disconnected from their work reality. For example, if an organization introduces a new customer relationship management system, leaders should not only say, hey, we're changing software, they should explain how the new system will help improve customer service, reduce errors, strengthen communication, support long-term organizational performance. That purpose gives change meaning. A second best practice is communicating early, clearly, and consistently. Communication is one of the most important elements of successful change management. Employees should not hear about major organizational changes through rumors, confusion, or last-minute announcements. Leaders must communicate what is changing, why it's changing, when it's happening, who will be affected, and what support will be available. Strong communication also requires repetition. One email or one meeting is not enough. People need time to process information, ask questions, understand how the change applies to their work. When communication is weak, uncertainty grows. When uncertainty grows, resistance often follows. So a third best practice is involving your stakeholders in the change process. Change should not always be done to people. Remember that. It shouldn't always be done to people. Whenever possible, it should be done with people. Employees, managers, customers, clients, teachers, students, professors, administrators, community members may have important insight into how change will work in practice. When stakeholders are included, they're more likely to feel respected, informed, and invested. Their feedback can also help you as a leader identify potential barriers before implementation begins. Sometimes the people closest to the work understand the risk, the inefficiencies, and the practical challenges better than any senior leadership who has not even stepped foot in the workspace. So a fourth best practice is preparing and supporting the people affected by the change. That's just, it's very important. I'm going to say, as a leader, it's very important to support your people that's going to be affected by the change. A lot of senior leaders, they miss this aspect of change management. Training, coaching, resources, and time are essential. As a leader, you can't expect employees to perform well under new expectations if they have not been properly prepared. If a new policy, system, or process is introduced without training, then your employees are going to become frustrated, make mistakes, or return to old habits. Support also includes emotional support. Change can create anxiety, especially when employees feel uncertain about their competence or future. Effective leaders acknowledge that change has a human side. And if you want to be effective, acknowledge that human side. You know, if you effective leaders can create space for questions, concerns, and have honest conversations, right? I like to say, you know, um, have truth conversations, because truth hurts all the time, but you got to have that conversation. Uh, Fifth best practice is aligning change with your organizational culture. Culture influences how people respond to change. If your organization has a culture of trust, communication, and accountability, change was often easier to implement. If the culture is built on fear, inconsistency, or poor communication, even a good change initiative is going to face some resistance. So, as a leader, you must ask whether the change fits your organizational values, mission, and operating environment. You must also consider whether the current culture supports or blocks the change. Sometimes successful change requires not only a new process, but also a shift in the mindset. So, a sixth best practice is creating a clear implementation plan, right? Change management requires structure. As a leader, you should identify your goals, your timelines, responsibilities, your resources, risks, milestones, and performance measures. Without a plan, your change can become disorganized and reactive. Okay, so a strong a strong implementation plan will help you and your employees understand what is expected and helps you as a leader monitor the progress. It also creates accountability. Everyone should know who is responsible for what deadlines must be met, and how success will be measured. So, a seventh best practice is monitoring the progress and making adjustments. So, understand change rarely goes exactly as planned. Okay. As a leader, you must be willing to gather some feedback, review data, identify problems, make improvements along the way. This is where flexibility becomes important as a leader. A change plan should be structured, but it should not be so rigid that as a leader you're going to ignore the reality. If your employees or teammates are struggling, if the process is not working, or if the intended outcomes are not being achieved, you as a leader must respond. Monitoring allows you to correct issues before they become larger problems. And another important best practice is celebrating progress. Change can be difficult. People need to see that their efforts matter. Reorganizing small wins helps build momentum and reinforces the value of the change. Celebration does not have to be extravagant. It can be just a simple acknowledgement of your team's effort, sharing uh, some some data of the progress, right, or highlighting some of your teammates who are helping move the organization forward. Through our 3XP leadership lens, we make change management even clearer, right? Our purpose is always going to explain why change matters. People, are going to remind our leaders that change affects human beings, not just our systems. So that's why at TMTSI we are very transparent when it comes to change and change management. Our process is going to provide the structure needed to implement and change effectively. And then the performance from that is just going to show whether the change is producing the intended results that we wanted in the first place. So we're always working here within 3XP leadership because it's our methodology, right? Um, when purpose, people, process, and performance are aligned, change becomes more than a reaction to pressure. It becomes a strategic leadership opportunity, right? And that's exactly how my company looks at it. It's a strategic leadership opportunity, and so best practices for change management. It's all about establishing a clear purpose, communicating consistently, involving stakeholders, supporting your employees or team members, aligning with the organizational culture, your culture, right? It can even be your community culture, and and creating an implementation plan, monitoring progress, and celebrating the wins. Your successful change doesn't happen simply because you announced as a leader, you announced it. It happens because you as a leader guided it with clarity, empathy, yes, structure, and accountability. When you have organizations that manage change well, or you're better prepared to adapt, innovate, and sustain performance over time. Change is not something that your organization should just go through. Change is something that you, as a strong leader, should help your organization grow through. So, with that, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you understand those are some of the best practices for change management.